Good morning, Celebration Center family. I'm just so glad you're joining us today. It's what an amazing world we live in to be able to have church via the internet and stream it in video here. I'm glad that you've chosen to spend your Sunday morning with us. We're all glad that we're able to get together, even from a distance, that we can still talk about God and worship God together. And obviously we have had some changes over the last couple weeks with having to do church differently. But I am just amazed at the creativity and just the resources that we have available to be doing things like this. And so clearly, doing things a little bit differently than planned. When Nathan had talked to me about doing this message a few months ago, I accepted, but thought I'd be doing it in person. And for those of you who haven't met me, I'm Marshall I'm on the governing board here, and not the normal speaker on Sunday morning. So I was glad to kind of help Nathan out here and be sharing the word and the message this morning. So next week you'll be back to Pastor Nathan bringing the word, but for today, I'm recording this here on a beautiful Saturday afternoon from my dining room. And so if you see my cat jumping around behind me, or maybe my dog barking, or a truck drive by or something, hopefully you just have a bit of grace for us here. These are definitely some changing times and different times, and so appreciate everybody's flexibility with that. But today we're going to be reading through and talking about the Apostle Peter. And I guess I want to start it out by asking you guys a question. Can you think of what's your favorite story? What's your favorite movie? Or maybe it's a book. Maybe it's a book that got turned into a movie, or maybe it's a movie that got turned into a book. Maybe it's even a sports story, right? I guess I'd ask, if you can, be curious, maybe put in the comment thing. If you're doing church online or in YouTube, why don't you put in the chat box there, or the comments, what is your favorite story, the book or movie or what have you? It'd be interesting to see what that is. One that I can think of right now, I was struggling with this one because I'm a sucker for a good story, a good movie. But one that I think of recently is Ford versus Ferrari. I'm a car guy. This movie is less about cars, more about the characters, which is kind of an interesting element. But I think like many of the stories that you can think of, your favorite stories are about a character that kind of overcomes some sort of adversity and maybe sinks to some low and things look bleak, and then they're able to resolve that and come out a better person and a changed person at the end of it. And I think really these things are part of God's design in us, right? We all love a good comeback story. Maybe that's a certain sports event or a movie or a book. But have you noticed with these, we don't love the middle, right? When things are low and bleak, we're not such fans then, right? But we love to, and when things don't have that low part, I don't think they're as memorable, right? And so we love to see this journey. And I do think that this is part of God's design, and just how he's built us to love to see that growth in things and in ourselves. And today, we're going to be talking about Peter, who's a great example of a story like that. And the Bible is really full of those kinds of stories. It does not read like a highlight reel. It does not look like somebody's Instagram page or Facebook page. It's not just the highlights. If you really read through the Bible, you see so many characters and major figures that have gone through real low points and have come back up on the other side through God's help and through God's provision. And so today we're going to read about Peter. We'll be in a couple different Gospels, but we'll start out in Matthew and we'll end up in John here. But starting out in Matthew chapter 4, verse 18, it starts out by saying, "While walking by the Sea of Galilee, he," speaking of Jesus, "he saw two brothers, Simon, who's called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." And immediately they left their nets, and they followed him. And so here's our first encounter, Jesus' first encounter with Peter. So he calls him and says, "Hey, quit being a fisher of fish and be a fisherman." And they follow him. And later in Matthew 16, Jesus really calls Peter out. And this is really this amazing event, right? Like, so Matthew 16, verse 16, he says, "Simon Peter answered, 'You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God.' And Jesus replied, 'Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it.'" So what does Jesus do here? He does a couple things, right? He starts out with Simon, but he changes his name to Peter. And Peter, many of you may know, means rock, right? So he changes his name from Simon, which is like the hearer or the listener, is what that means, to the rock, the foundation that he's going to build his church on. And so this is an amazing calling on Peter to say, here's who you were, here's who you're going to be, and this is my plan for you. And I could not imagine such a great calling, such an important and a just a significant calling. And so Peter goes from here with Jesus and the apostles, and he goes for years really working with Jesus on a day-to-day basis and just doing life with him, ministering, seeing miracles happen, just amazing stories that you read throughout the next 10 chapters of Matthew here, but as well as many others. And so the next part of Peter's story here we're going to read is in Matthew chapter 26. So this is after Jesus is arrested and put on trial and is about to be crucified. So in chapter 26 of Matthew, starting in verse 69, we read this other part. So Matthew 26:69. "Now Peter was sitting outside of the courtyard, and a servant girl came up to him and said, 'You also were with Jesus the Galilean.' But he denied it before them all, saying, 'I do not know what you mean.' And when he went out to the entrance, another servant girl saw him, and she said to the bystanders, 'This man was with Jesus of Nazareth.' And again he denied it with an oath, 'I do not know the man.' After a little while, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, 'Certainly you too are one of them, for your accent betrays you.' And he began to invoke a curse on himself and swear, 'I do not know the man.' And immediately the rooster crowed. And Peter remembered the saying of Jesus, 'Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times.' And he went out and wept bitterly." So here is Peter when times are tough and he blows it, right? He denies that he knows Jesus 3 times. If I'm being honest, Peter is so relatable here. We all mess up. And I think the real question is, do we recover? And how do we recover from that? So we're going to talk about this next chapter in Peter's life and how he does recover, because this is not the end of the story. This is just the middle, right? So in John 21, starting in verse 15, this is after Jesus has been crucified and resurrected, and comes out and visits Peter and the other disciples. So John 21, verse 15 starts and says, "When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, 'Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?' He said to him, 'Yes, Lord, you know that I love you.' And he said to him, 'Feed my lambs.' Jesus said to him a second time, 'Simon, son of John, do you love me?' He said to him, 'Yes, Lord, you know that I love you.' And he said to him, 'Tend my sheep.' He said to him a third time, 'Simon, son of John, do you love me?' Peter was grieved because of this, because he said to him a third time, 'Do you love me?' And he said to him, 'Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you.' And Jesus said to him, 'Feed my sheep.'" So here we see a picture of Jesus talking with Peter and reminding him of his calling, right? So this really isn't the end of the story, right? So Peter has this failing, and he has this restoration, and really this charge that Jesus is giving him again to be that pastor, to be that shepherd of the flock. So we've got to remember, and this is my first point here, that failure isn't final. We can see that Peter's story doesn't end with the denial. And in fact, it even continues beyond John 21, which we just read. It goes on to do amazing things throughout the New Testament. And many of our church stories even today we spend so much time talking about it, right? So his fall is not the end of his story, it's just the middle. And I think an important thing to remember is that things in the middle often look like failures. If you think about baking a cake, right? You looks nice on the box or whatever, you mix it all together, put it in the oven, but if you were to take it out in the middle of the baking process, it would look like a total failure. It would just look like this big puddle of goo, right? Very unappetizing and just a total failure if you were to judge it at that point. But if you leave it in the whole time and really see it through to the end, you can be a success, right? Another example I was thinking of are, maybe it's because of springtime here or something, but butterflies and caterpillars, right? You take the caterpillar and it goes into its cocoon and it turns into this goo where it's just reconfiguring itself, and it emerges this beautiful butterfly. But if you were to kind of measure it in the middle of that process, you wouldn't have expected this beautiful thing to come out from the end of it. And sometimes we focus on that middle part and that when we're the goo, right? And so that's what we think is just going to be the situation in the end of the story. And it's just the middle, and we need to have more patience and wait it out and see it to its completion. And I think that we often look at ourselves and expect ourselves to have this constantly improving trajectory that, each day is our new best day. And that just isn't the way that life works. And I think for many of us, we know that of ourselves, but we still seem to sometimes expect it. And I just want you to know it's okay to have setbacks. It's normal. Jesus knows that we'll have setbacks. That's not going to be a surprise to him. Just like it wasn't a surprise that Peter denied him. Jesus knew it. He told Peter he was going to do it, right? In fact, Jesus knew he was going to do it when he called him and told him he was going to be his rock. He knew it from the beginning. It didn't surprise him. And when he asked Peter if he loved him, he knew what the answer was. He knew that Peter loved him. You really think about it, right? God has never said, it didn't work out like I expected. I didn't see that one coming, right? It just doesn't happen. God, that's not possible, right? And so I guess when I think about this story, who really needed to hear Peter say that he loved him, right? I think it really was Peter. Peter needed to hear himself say that. We often do this ourselves. We have to say things out loud to kind of remind ourselves of things. And I think this is what's going on with Jesus and Peter in this story. When we go through setbacks, we need to be reminded. We need to be reminded of our love for God, not just God's love for us, but our love for God too. And that helps us to remember what He's done for us and His calling for us as well. And when you fall short, and we will, let's just remember to not let that be the end of our story. We can often feel when we've made these mistakes that we're disqualified, that we can't continue. Just like when you're running a race or doing some sort of sport, if you're disqualified, you don't get to go back to the beginning and try again. You're done. But when we make a mistake in our lives and in our path with Jesus, they're expected, and we're not disqualified. We may be unqualified, right? And the big difference there to me is that when we're unqualified, there's still hope for us. There's still a process, and really, God can be that qualification for us. So many of the stories throughout the Bible are full of people that weren't qualified. You look at Gideon, who God calls a mighty warrior, right? He says himself he was from the smallest clan, and just didn't see it in himself. But and we look at Moses, who is called to speak to Pharaoh for the whole nation, and he says, well, I can't, I don't speak well, right? And God becomes his qualification for him. And so God is the one that qualifies us, even when we're feeling unqualified. So just don't feel disqualified when you've made a mistake. I think the second point that I want to make today is that we need to go to Jesus for restoration. He's really the one that can restore us, and we often try to shortcut that process or do it on our own, by ourselves, and that never sticks. It's never successful. It's not a real restoration. If you look back at Peter's story arc, right? He starts out as a fisherman. He goes and is called to follow Jesus, so he does. He's called to be the rock of the church, and he does ministry with Jesus for a while. And then he hits his low point, right? We just read that. He denies that he even knows Jesus. He swears, he puts a curse on himself, right? Or an oath. I don't know him. And then after he does that, he feels just that shame of knowing what he did, that he denied Jesus. And he goes back to fishing, what he's used to doing. He goes back to the spot that he was before he was called to follow Jesus. And I think we often do that ourselves. We just go back to what's comfortable. And when we make a mistake, it's like, blew that, time to go back to what I was doing before. And I just want you to all be encouraged that that we're not disqualified from that. We are still called to more than that. So when Jesus asks him, "Do you love me more than these?" I don't know if Jesus is asking him if he loves him more than the people he's with, or Jesus loves him more than the fish that he caught. I don't really know, but I do know it doesn't matter, right? The answer is yes. That Peter loves Jesus more than any of those things. And even though he went back to it, he still loves Jesus. And he just needed to be reminded of that, I think, and he needed to be with Jesus for that restoration. So maybe you can think of a routine or a place that you head back to when things are falling apart. I think it's normal, but it's not always good. I think with Jesus is where we need to be when things are falling apart. When things are rough, he's the one we need to be going to. Think about right now with talk about COVID-19 and just things shutting down and things like, it seems like every day it's a little bit different news story, and just changing world, changing environment, not just from hospitals and maybe fear of getting sick and things like that, but just from financial impacts that are coming and just the uncertainty. It really resonated with me reading through Peter's story this week in preparation to this message, that Peter had followed Jesus for years, and to see him crucified, I mean, his world must have just felt like it was falling apart around him, just a whirlwind, right? And I think that's really relatable right now. And I think that for some of us, we are going back to things that we're thinking that things are no longer possible. And so I think we're going back to some of the places where we're comfortable with, and maybe some of the old habits. And I think that those can be healthy, but not if that's where we stay, right? I need to maybe sit in that spot for a little bit, but then go to Jesus and get our calling reconfirmed and restored there. I think that we often look for consistency and things that we know when we're in troubling times. And I would just say, what's more consistent than Jesus? He is the same today as he has always been. And so while we may understand him better or differently today than we did yesterday or years ago, he's still the same. We're just discovering more. And so with him is where that ultimate consistency lies. And so I would just ask you to come to him, and you'll be restored. And I think when we turn to him, just like Peter, what we do find is acceptance and comfort and love. We find that Jesus loves us. I mean, if I'm in Peter's shoes and I think back at this, what might have I expected, right, of Jesus? That here I had my last interaction with Jesus on earth was denying him, and here I am seeing him again. And I would have expected him, right, if he was a human, just a mortal, to say something like, "You blew it. Where were you? You denied me. I thought we were, I thought you were going to follow me, and you denied me." And just to really call that out, right? But Jesus doesn't do that. He welcomes him with a meal, right? And he doesn't remind him of what he's done. Peter knows what he did. Jesus knows what he did. He doesn't need that. What he needs is this reminder and this restoration of of what Jesus has called him to. I mean, can you imagine how much shame that Peter must have felt? This is the third time that Jesus appeared to the disciples. And so Peter might have heard about that. The other two times, I'm not sure, right? But he wasn't actively out looking for him at this point. And when he does see him, it says he jumps out of the boat and comes and runs ashore to him. So clearly he was glad to see him, but he wasn't actively searching him out. And to be fair, right? I mean, you read through the scripture that the other disciples were with him, so he wasn't just on his own running away or anything. But Jesus comes and finds him. He meets him where Peter is at, and Jesus will do that with us too. Even when we're maybe hunkered down, Jesus will meet us where we're at. I've definitely been guilty of this myself, of kind of slinking away to maybe get my head right or whatever you'd want to call it, which again I think is okay and is healthy, and it's just you can't stay there. You still need to go back to Jesus. In Peter's case, this was fishing, right? And fishing for a profession. Maybe for some of us, it's fishing for a hobby. But fishing didn't restore Peter. The fishing is not going to restore us. It's going to be the presence of Jesus that's going to restore us. And so I guess I'll say, how do we go to Jesus? I think that this can look like a lot of different things, but for me, I know when I'm anxious, I often will have kind of this anxious energy about me, or maybe you even bite my nails or something, right? But when you find yourself doing that, just stop that activity, quiet yourself, and go to him in prayer, and just know that he wants to hear all of it. Bring to him your fears, your emotions, even if you have doubts, bring to him your doubts. His love is not fragile. He is able to take it, and he's able to talk with you about it, and you can put that on him. He's not afraid of it. And so just go to him with those things and just be real honest and open with him in your prayer time with him. And I would say, if you've got maybe a scripture that's really spoken to you over the past, that you would just meditate on that, maybe just repeat it to yourself, and just be constantly thinking about that, and just that truth that lies in it, and just be focused on that. And I think another question to think about is, how to get over failure. And I would say, first, you need to recognize that God's grace for you. I think that when we think about God's grace, it's easier for us to have grace for ourselves. Just remember his grace, that you're not disqualified from serving him. Have grace for yourself, and then have grace for other people. I think by practicing grace for other people and forgiveness, that we can really, it's easier to apply it to ourselves when we're applying it to others. And right now, I think people need it. If they're like me, over this last couple weeks, especially this last week, I found myself being really distracted, and still have the same expectation on myself about how much work I can produce, or just to be functioning like I was before before all the social distancing measures have been put in place. But just give yourself grace and forgiveness there, and adjust your expectations on yourself and adjust your expectations on others, because this time is different. This world is different than it was 2 or 3 weeks ago. And so for a time, we're going to have to just kind of recalibrate on that, and that's okay. So just give yourself some grace there. So know also that my third point here is really that to know that Jesus gives us perspective. If we move towards his plan, even when we've had a detour. So you look back at when Jesus calls Peter back towards his original plan. He doesn't just meet him and say, "Peter, I still love you." He doesn't just console him. He reminds him of his calling, and I think God does that for us too. When we go to him, he'll kind of reaffirm us and tell us that he loves us, and we'll know that. But he still calls us. He still has a plan for us, and so we just need to remember that plan as well. That it's not just for our benefit, but we need to be expecting in anticipation that he still has a plan for us, because he does. He hasn't changed his plan for us. It's different for each one of us. His calling is unique for each of us, but it is still true for each of us that he has that calling, and it's not changed for us despite our circumstances. As I was preparing for this message, there are so many parallels, I think, of this story of Peter and another parable of the prodigal son. So that parable is found in Luke chapter 15, and really it starts out with a father and 2 sons. His youngest son basically says, I want you to give me my inheritance now. I don't want to be under your roof or under your rules anymore, so just cash me out. And so he does, and he goes off on his own, and he really squanders his money on kind of wildlife and just kind of just doesn't make prudent choices with it, and really just a lot of indulging, and not surprising, runs out of money, and he finds himself hungry, feeding pigs, and just really at that low spot. And so where we'll pick it up is in Luke chapter 15, verse 18. It reads, and this is the son speaking, it says, "I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants." And he arose and he came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion, and he ran and embraced him and kissed him. So that's an important part. I think I just want to pause here real quick. The father sees him even though he's far away, and he runs to him, right? And the son said to him, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son." So I also want to point out, right, that the son has practiced this script, and what he's going to say, but he doesn't even say that before the father runs to him and kisses him, right? He's just happy to see him back. He doesn't need the apology first, right? Just like Peter didn't have to apologize to Jesus, he knew, right? And he was just glad to see him. So we continue back here starting in verse 22. But the father said to his servants, "Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hands and shoes on his feet, and bring the fattened calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." And they began to celebrate. So in both cases, the father and Jesus, so the father comes to the son when he's far off. Jesus comes to Peter when he's out fishing, right? So they came to the person that needed it. And there's no condemnation in any of these stories, right? So there's no, you should have done this, shouldn't have done that, none of that. It's just, and the restoration is full, right? In both cases, Jesus talks to Peter about, "Do you love me? Well, feed my sheep," right? So he's still calling him out into this pastorship, into this leadership, and this shepherding that Jesus wants for Peter and wants for his church, right? And just like that with the son, the father puts back the ring on him, and it's the kind of the sign of authority, right? With that ring, you can still conduct the kind of official business, right? So in that parable, there's still some story, some additional story there where he still has to, he's kind of cashed out his inheritance already, but he still is a son. He's not a servant. He's not treated as as a servant. He's still treated as a son with that same authority. And Jesus doesn't change his plan for Peter, right? He's still on plan A. There's no plan B. It's not like Jesus goes to Peter and says, well, since you did this, we got to change things up a little bit. He still has that same plan for him. He still is reminding him that I still need you to feed my sheep, and I still need you to tend to the flock. And this is the same with us. God's calling on us and plan for us is still the same, despite what we may have done or mistakes that we've made. And really, it's a consistent theme throughout the Bible. It's one of a restoring God and a redemptive God. He loves to take broken things and broken situations and make new things and beautiful things and grow his kingdom. He's a powerful, ever-present God. His kingdom growth doesn't depend on our individual success. We're just lucky enough to be partnering with him and working with him, and just to be serving such a loving God. And I think when Jesus asks if Peter loves him, it really is for Peter's benefit. It's to remind Peter that Peter really does love Jesus, and that Jesus still has a plan for him, that he hasn't lost confidence in Peter, and that Peter is still called to a purpose, right? And I think many times we feel like we've blown it and that we've disqualified ourselves, but we just sometimes need to hear God remind us, and for ourselves to remind ourselves that we still are loved, we still love God, and that we're still called, and there's still a purpose for us. So I just want to remind you all that just to remember that you're never too far for God. Remember God's call and plan for you is still as true today as it was at the beginning. Even when you've made a misstep, or you're trying to go back to what's familiar out of fear or to hide, he's still calling you, and he still has a plan for you. He's patiently waiting for you. There may be some steps that you have to take for that restoration, but Jesus won't shame you. He won't punish you. He won't shame you for those mistakes, right? He's not waiting to punish you. But always that first step is to turn to Jesus for that restoration. That's always the first step. And so we think back about this. So Peter, of course, does continue to grow on and help to grow that church, right? If we think back about how the story could have gone, if Peter hadn't gone to Jesus for that restoration, could you imagine what a different world, different church we would have if Peter tried to build this church out of a sense of making it up to Jesus, or filling this wound and trying to just kind of prove himself. I think we often try to do that ourselves. We have this wound and we try to fill that void full of accomplishments, or trying to prove ourselves, or put something out there that really isn't true, just and hide some of these other aspects of our life and our struggle and our story. What we really need to do, and this is what Peter did, is he went to Jesus first, got restored, got that healing, and then he could be released to grow that church. And so with your calling, and if you've had some missteps or you feel condemned or disqualified, just go to Jesus first, get that healing, and then go out, because that's how things are going to actually last and be healthy, not the other way around. You're not going to be able to earn God's love. You're not going to be able to earn your way back into God's plan. Just go to him first, be restored. That's Jesus's job, right? Jesus does that restoration. There's nothing you can do to earn it. And so just go to him, and then you'll be able to go on your calling, and you'll that's really the only healthy way to do it. So in closing, I've got a couple more, kind of summary thoughts and just some questions for application over this next week. I just want to remind you and encourage you that your circumstances don't dictate your calling. We've read about Peter here in his circumstances. You can read about stories in the Old Testament of Gideon, the mighty warrior that was found in threshing his wheat and hiding. You can read the story about Moses, who just is, running from God, hiding out in the desert because he had killed somebody, and frankly just saying he's not qualified to speak to Pharaoh because of his his speech impediment, I guess. So these circumstances don't dictate our calling. God is the one that provides or gives us that calling, and He's the one that will keep that calling, and that will draw us back towards that when we've maybe gone astray. You should remember too that you're not disqualified from it. So even if you have gone astray or you've missed it from time to time, you're not disqualified. You just need to go to God for that restoration. So as you're thinking about that this week and praying over stuff, I just pray that you would be thinking about what you need to go to Jesus for. What do you need to be restored in? What's keeping you from going to God in that? And I want to think through, and I would just encourage us all to be thinking this week and beyond, as we're having to do church from a distance and do really community from a distance, that we would just be thinking about how can we shepherd God's flock during this time. Like Peter, it's a challenge, right? I mean, he had lots of challenges in trying to shepherd that flock, and we do too, but it's still our calling, right? As a church, as a body of believers, it is our calling to still care for one another and shepherd that flock. And so I guess want to close with reminding us of that same question that Jesus asks Peter 3 times, and Peter's response, of course, is the same each time, but Jesus has kind of 3 statements that he makes here. So, the question is, do you love me, right? And of course, Peter's answers all 3 times is, of course, you know that I do. Jesus says, so feed my lambs. So I would ask, what can you do to help encourage those who are younger in age or spiritual maturity? So maybe the kids in your house, what can you do to encourage them as in their faith this week? And he asks again, do you love me? And he says, tend to my sheep. So what can we do this week to care for those around us in our neighborhood or in the church body? What can we be doing to really care and demonstrate community to those, even though it may look different right now? And then, of course, so it's the 3rd time he asks them. He says, do you love me? And of course, yes. So he says, feed my sheep. Feed my sheep. What can we do this week to encourage those and grow in faith and help others grow in faith that are maybe more of our peers or maybe along the same line? So what can we be doing to help feed our flock, our congregation this week as well? So I just want to close out in prayer. I just am so glad for all of you. I just encourage you to be thinking about the church and the people that you know and that you're used to seeing on Sunday. Give them a call. Do something to reach out to them this week. And I would just be really encouraged to see maybe you can do a picture of how you're doing church right now and put that on the church's Facebook page. Maybe comment on this post, and I would just be really encouraged to see how folks are doing church right now. If that's huddled around, a radio, or huddled around a TV, or maybe a Bible study, or what have you. I know the church will continue to grow during this time, and it'll look different, but God's message hasn't changed. Just maybe the methods that we need to do church right now have. And so let me pray for you as we close out this message. God, I thank you for everybody joining in this morning. I thank you for your church. I thank you for your calling for all of us. We just serve such an amazing God that is so full of love. And so I just pray that we would all feel that love, feel that comfort this week. Pray that you just give us all creative ways of encouraging and reaching out to one another that you would just give us a sense of peace in this storm that's going on right now. I know there's lots of scares in terms of, and anxiety in terms of health, in terms of job situations, God. And I just pray that you would unleash blessings in all of those areas, but also that you would just help us to feel your closeness and your peace that is really close to us right now. Pray that you would just help us to draw closer to you during this time, closer to our families, that we would just feel your peace washing over us as we navigate these changing times. And so this week, I just pray you would be honored, that your kingdom would grow, and that the folks joining this morning would just be able to find encouragement as they go along this week. So Lord, we just ask these things in your powerful, mighty name, God. Amen. So thank you, everybody. I appreciate you. We're praying for you. Know that I'm praying for you, that I love you, and I just, I just look forward to the time where we can be back together in the same room, doing church together on Sundays. Have a great week. Be blessed.